Live, this is Alan Jones.
Well, thank you, Andrew. Always doing wonderful work. Andrew Bolt. Look, good evening to you all. Thank you for being with us. We say that every night and we mean it. There is plenty on. What a world we're in. Here we are, desperately short on vaccines and in lockdown. It's now the time, is it, for the Prime Minister to be talking about climate change? Though I've got to say, stay around. I'm giving him a big rap later on. The Prime Minister, his finest utterance in months and months. Now, Prime Minister, I don't want you in some kind of Malcolm-esque death spiral. Moderna vaccine, for example, was available in the US in December 2020 and in the EU in January. Yet our Therapeutic Goods Administration, and you want to read their reports in detail, have just approved Moderna. Where is the urgency instead of lethargy? I had a note from a viewer who was speaking to a young bank manager in a major regional city today. The bank manager reportedly had said that the level of customer desperation and, sadly, violence in the bank is skyrocketing such that the police have to be called in. Because in lockdown, people are seeing all of their survival lines cut off, jobs, the banks, even the pub for a drink, they can't afford it, while they watch politicians and bureaucrats on thousands and thousands of dollars a week ordering them about. How can this not end badly? It's not as though people are asking for big amounts. They just want money to keep themselves going, and they can't get it because they're being trampled on by the march of the elite. Some health officers, Jeanette Young here listing, $12,600 a week, who then get promoted to Governor of Queensland, while the police have to be called in because that was a Queensland town to control the desperate and the frightened. Is this Australia? We had more of it this morning at the New South Wales Premier's press conference. 95,000 tested, 356 cases. But the positive cases are 0.3%, 0.3%. And the Chief Health Officer says she was concerned about the number of elderly people who aren't vaccinated. Listen to this.
It's always so sad when you hear about deaths, especially of elderly people who unfortunately, for whatever reason, weren't vaccinated.
Can I make a simple suggestion? Vaccinate them. We have a chief medical officer. And after 18 months, remember yesterday when Chandon Berejiklian freaked out about regional communities, lockdowns everywhere. The Northern Rivers were put into lockdown with 1 hour's notice. 1 hour? How do people live like this? They can't. But despite the hype from Chandon Berejiklian yesterday, there were no additional cases in the Byron Shire and the northern New South Wales region, and no additional cases in Tamworth and Armidale. So what are we on about, apart from power and control? But the fear tactics continue. The bloke who apparently wants to be the police commissioner, Warboys, said that over 400 vehicles were stopped by police to see if vehicles were travelling with a reasonable excuse, and only 7 were turned around, 7 out of 400. While police resources are being wasted on this, people are robbing one another, drugs are being peddled, and domestic violence is at a disturbing level. Read the dreadful story in Western Sydney today. Berejiklian was asked about the fact that we're 7 weeks in and the numbers rise. Listen to this.
Policy positions that may have worked in the past aren't going to have effect with Delta, and that is something we need to accept.
Is she simply saying we're going to have to live with the virus or not? What are we? Or won't you admit it, Gladys? Yes, we have to live with the virus. She then says this, listen.
Your approach has to be different. Fortunately, we have the tool of the vaccine.
Well, yes, we do. Open us up and let people get the vaccine if they want to, and we can live with it. Except some people can't get vaccinated when they want to. That failure is never admitted. There are people everywhere writing to me saying, I can't get on the list. People won't take my calls. I can't register. And of course, anything about personal responsibility, I'm responsible for my health, not the government. Only a control freak would think otherwise. Then Berejiklian proves we're leaderless politically. Listen.
If the health advice suggested to us there was further we needed to do, of course we would do that.
Really? Well, let's shut down the health advice. OK, I'll tell you what we do. Shut down Macquarie Street, George Street and Spring Street in Melbourne and hand the keys to the Jeanette Youngs and the Kerry Chants and all the other unelected bureaucrats. You know, at the 2019 New South Wales election, Chant's name wasn't on the ballot paper. The reporter James O'Doherty asked why Berejiklian can't accept that we won't get to zero emissions. She responds, listen.
The New South Wales government has always said that our strategy is to get to as close to zero as we can to those cases infectious in the community. But regrettably, we've seen those numbers increase in the last few days. But that is the binding principle which National Cabinet has to follow. However, we have said in New South Wales, as I've said continually, that higher vaccination rates will give us additional freedoms. There is no doubt about that, because what we need to prevent is people ending up in hospital.
So we still talk about this unconstitutional National Cabinet birthed by the Prime Minister and this whole notion of keeping people out of hospital. Hospitals are for sick people. Hello? Why are we so anti people ending up in hospital? Smoking your entire life can place you in hospital for lung cancer, so let the government ban the sale of cigarettes. Eating 2 fast food burgers every day for a week will eventually land you in hospital with obesity or diabetes, so let's see the government shut down all fast food chains. How far do we go with this rubbish? People end up in hospital to be treated. That's what hospitals are for. Then what does the Premier mean by this?
At least 6 million jabs delivered by the end of August, because that does give us opportunity as to what people can do in September and October.
Some? So even if we roll up our sleeves and get vaccinated, Berejiklian may afford us some of our freedoms, but we could still be in lockdown until at least October. Today is August 10. That's over 7 more weeks minimum. Got it? Gladys, time to give it away. Listen to this comment by the Health Minister, Brad Hazzard.
You can't legislate against stupidity, arrogance and entitlement.
Brad, you should be so lucky that we can't. And listen to this.
But we're not in the business of putting in provisions or asking people to do things if they're not going to have an effect in reducing the case numbers.
Well, look, if that's the case, we're in week 7 of the lockdown and cases haven't dropped, so why don't you change direction? Urge everyone to vaccinate, but tell the truth about whether the vaccine is available. And it's not, at least not in the numbers and with the speed we need. Tell the truth why it's not. You say you're not in the business of putting in place things that don't work. Premier, what you have presided over now is not working. Chant is asked what more she'll do after 7 weeks. The cases haven't budged. She doesn't know. This is no answer. And she says this, listen.
We have a huddle with police every morning and we say these are the areas we're really concerned about.
Oh, this is laughable. Oh, so the police are now the health experts. We meet with them every morning. It seems increasingly clear there are no experts. The Berejiklian team is guessing and failing. Berejiklian this morning under tremendous pressure and aware that she is the least consultative person in government says this, listen.
So we'll be working with industry on our plans moving forward.
Gladys, you do as you please because you're defiant and fighting for your political life. Berejiklian pretends now that she runs a cabinet government when she knows she doesn't. Listen to this.
Cabinet colleagues are consulted on an ongoing basis.
Well, I know for a fact they're not. But nothing today positive, no breath of hope. I repeat what I said yesterday and I'd change it today. Why couldn't we say something like this? It'd be nice to hear a leader say to the public out there something like, well, just an update for you. We had 95,000 tests in the last 24 hours. Say it gently to them. It's a lot of tests, I know. 356 tested positive. But as you can understand, that's almost 95,000 that were negative. So that's good. And we have a good health system, I told you that yesterday, to look after the sick. And we'll keep working to look after you. So look, I want you to be happy and confident, hopeful, and trust us to work with you to get the job done. And we can all then get on with our lives. Now, keep doing the right thing. I'll be back tomorrow. I hope I can put a smile on your face then. Instead, around Australia, 10 million people are locked up like battery hens in government-directed prison, governed by people who preach alarm and fear at every turn. I'm sorry, if there is not a better way, we are stuffed. What do you think? Email me, alan@skynews.com.au or the text line 0414 000 848. Look, just one significant point amongst the political dogfighting going on in New South Wales. Tanya Davies, as I told you yesterday, is presenting a private member's bill to the Parliament in layman's terms, opposing vaccine passports and compulsory vaccination. I told you the Berejiklian crowd would mobilise against Tanya Davies, even though she has significant ministerial support. Well, it was a pile-on today, brutal, bullying, pile-on. Overnight, Barilaro circulated an email opposing Tanya Davies' proposal, and then, of course, it was leaked to the media, which has prompted a Tanya Davies response. And I know which side the public would agree. It's now been made public, in which she tells Mr Barilaro, and I quote, "I find your article extremely concerning and flawed. When you say that vaccinations are the pathway to freedom, you're saying that as part of the cabinet that has created this ultimatum in the first place." She says, "The Prime Minister and the New South Wales Crisis Cabinet have failed the people of Australia and New South Wales in not using the multi-million-dollar taxpayer-funded departments to find a better way out of this pandemic, than locking everyone up and threatening them with their livelihoods." Tanya Davies wrote, "I know you're a tireless fighter for the bush," because she's a very Christian lady here. She said, "I know the leadership must be feeling emotionally exhausted throughout this trying time, but if the Prime Minister, Premier and her crisis cabinet can't use their significant resources to find a better way to open up other than trampling upon and forcing a medical procedure in order for people to feed their families and live life, then they've failed their jobs as leaders." She said, Tanya Davies, "This is Australia, not communist China," unquote. Let me tell you something. This is not the only example of bullying we've seen from this government. Ask Matthew Mason Cox. But Tanya Davies won't be bullied. Well, I want to go to Mark Latham because he has raised very significant issues in the Parliament that deserve to be ventilated, or the comment he made to me at the weekend that these are issues that, quote, you won't read in the media. Let's go to Mark. Mark, thank you for your time. But look, talking about the media, congratulations. I'm a hard marker, you know that. This bloke has done an outstanding piece of writing for tomorrow's edition of the Daily Telegraph in Sydney on Kevin Rudd, with Rudd's obsession about News Corp and therefore Sky News, and he wants a royal commission to Murdoch. And Mark talks about such a proposal producing pitiful laughter in Canberra. But Mark, to put it in layman's language, the hypocrisy is breathtaking. You know that Rudd sucked up to Rupert Murdoch's journalists to try to win the Prime Ministership, don't you?
Oh, absolutely, Alan. Kevin Rudd was in the federal parliament for 15 years, and no one in the history of that institution spent more time trying to garner support and column inches and favourable coverage from one single media outlet than Kevin Rudd and News Corp. Kevin Rudd was full-time. David Pemberton, who used to edit the Daily Telegraph, joke they thought they had to take out a restraining order on the guy to stop him from basically following them around and ringing them up every 5 minutes to try and get a bit of coverage in the newspaper. And, of course, in 2007, he famously had dinner with Rupert Murdoch in New York. Kevin Rudd was there, best buddy pal, and everything was going along swimmingly. And Rudd was very happy to have the support of the Daily Telegraph and the Australian to become Prime Minister in 2007. But now, unfortunately, Rudd, who's quite a disturbed individual, is living in a time warp. He thinks it's 2013, that because the Murdoch media, like most Australians, thought that the Rudd years were completely unelectable and unsupportable in 2013, and they supported Tony Abbott. Rudd has now launched the most obsessive, vicious, revengeful campaign against the media outlet that previously he was having a love affair with. So it's hypocritical, it's worrying, and quite frankly, you know, everyone in politics has grudges, you know, who hasn't in life. But with the passage of time, they sort of become very insignificant, irrelevant. But for Kevin Rudd, no word of a lie, this guy is trapped in 2013. That Murdoch and others and the Australian people fell out of love with him and voted him out of office.
That's it. And now attacking Sky News, of course. I mean, just a quick one on that. You say that Australian politics has never seen anything like Rudd.
Well, this level of obsession, I know Malcolm Turnbull's got something similar going against News Corp, but he doesn't sit there like Edward Scissorhands every day cutting out articles out of the News Corp papers and posting them on social media. You know, I say in my piece there that if the Friendly Geordies crew was in trouble for stalking John Barilaro, Rudd's stalking of Murdoch, he'll spend 20 years in Boggo Road. I mean, Murdoch ought to ring up and say, this guy from Queensland looks like Colonel Sanders, who's been following me around on social media. Well, like Colonel Sanders, Rudd belongs in a very white
Brilliant
coat.
writing. That's enough. Look, I won't cover the rest of the article. It's brilliant writing by Mark Latham in tomorrow's Daily Telegraph. Listen, Doherty modelling to the things you say that we won't read in the media. Doherty, very, very reputable Australian. But do you have concerns about this modelling? Because it's now saying that if we get Australia to 80% vaccination, we could still have 280,000 coronavirus cases, including 40,000 amongst vaccinated people. I mean, this assumes minimal restrictions, but we've only had 36,000 cases since the start of last year, Australia-wide. Are these valid figures?
Well, we know from economics, Alan, that modelling is only as effective as the assumptions you plug in to the model. And some experts, I saw Stephen Duckett and some other experts expressing some concern on social media about the assumptions about best practice contact tracing. Certainly not happening in New South Wales at the moment. Basically, the system has broken down. But there's an interesting assumption they use for a 3.6 reproduction rate of the virus. Some people say it's higher, some say it's lower. But the assumption used in the Doherty report is drawn from New South Wales circumstances in March this year, when we only had 3 COVID cases in the entire month, and Delta was yet to arrive in New South Wales. So they don't, to me, seem to factor in the natural human reaction. And you've made this point repeatedly, that you've got to factor in individual responsibility in the face of what looks like a worrying health situation. You, as an individual, take precautions. So they don't seem to be factored into the model, which, they might improve the model over time, but it's got some hairs on it at the moment.
And the figures are frightening. The protest march was supposed to be a super spreader. Was that fake news?
Well, it was written up. A lot of media hysteria. It was terrible to see any attacks on the police, of course. They're only trying to do their job. But the media said this is a super spreading event. But we haven't had in New South Wales a single COVID transmission outdoors, which, beggars the question as to why they ever closed down the construction industry, given that most of the workers are outdoors. But Hazard was asked about this on the weekend. No confirmed transmission out of that protest march. We'd obviously had a lot of people there. And I see an update out of the Hunter Valley. They said, there might be some young fellas came up from southwest Sydney to spread it into the Hunter on the beach party, but they're now saying it was a house party to do with Newcastle University students. So we haven't had an outdoor transmission in New South Wales, nor, according to the answer I got on the notice paper, have we had a confirmed transmission on the New South Wales public transport systems.
I just want to
which
ask
is quite
you that.
remarkable, because they've scared the pants off people. There's no one on the trains, I can tell you. And it'll be a long while before they get back to a viable patronage level on public transport. But if you haven't had a single COVID...
Just basing that, Mark, you asked that question, how many confirmed cases of COVID transmissions on public transport, and did you get a firm answer, or did they avoid you?
Oh, well, Hazard said that they had some suspicions, or there could be likely ones, but unless they can confirm it, we were told at one stage that this was world best practice, contact tracing, gold standard. Well, you'd think the gold standard would know what had been happening on the trains, buses and ferries. So they couldn't confirm a single case. And it'll take a long while to get any viable level of public transport patronage back in New South Wales, because they've scared the pants off people. But it just makes the point, Alan, like the COVID is real. The COVID is a health risk, but the COVID also moves in unexpected ways. We're early into this and still learning about it as we go along. And we need a lot more evidence-based policy, particularly when it comes to the things like outdoor work and the use of public transport. Follow the evidence that we've got accumulated now over 18 months. We need a lot more evidence, but scaring people is not a solution.
Okay, just a quick one before you go. The performance of Hazard today during that parliamentary inquiry examining the coalition's response to the lockdown, you're talking about evidence. Chant was asked perfectly legitimate questions, none of which Hazard could answer, other than to say the inquiry was a beat up on the government, but beat it up somewhere else because Dr. Chant's really busy and I'm really busy. I mean, what do you make of this kind of defiant, arrogant attitude?
Well, Alan, ironically, it's on the day that the New South Wales Parliament was supposed to resume after its winter recess. There was supposed to be a sitting of the Legislative Assembly and the Legislative Council today, and democracy was suspended because Labor and Liberal got together and said we won't have the Parliament sitting. What you saw there today was a couple of hours of second or third best option before an upper house committee, And Hazzard's attitude was this is a waste of Kerry Chan's time.
Absolutely.
No democratic accountability, no transparency, no willingness to be frank, to table the health advice, and let the public see what's really been going on. And the arrogant attitude to say it was a waste of her time has sort of confirmed what we've feared. This is more a health dictatorship in New South Wales than a democracy.
Absolutely, Mark. You're doing brilliant work. We've asked for the evidence. And here are the representatives of the people saying, we don't have to be here. You're lucky that we've turned up. Just appalling, but that is a metaphor of the way they're behaving. Good to talk to you, Mark, and we'll talk to you again next week. Mark Latham. Well, after that, let's now go to Peter on a totally different subject altogether. This Extinction Rebellion. Peter, as you saw, and I kept saying, as you sow, so shall you reap. As far as I'm aware, no one in the federal government's uttered a single syllable for months and months in criticism of this Marxist Extinction Rebellion mob. And here they are today defacing the front of Parliament House, gluing themselves to a forecourt and setting a pram on fire. Peter, simply, where is the security?
Look, it really surprises me. If anyone else does anything wrong in that building, even if it's a young child, and they swoop on you relatively pretty quickly. But they were, drawing and defacing the lodge, the front, facade of the lodge. They're all over the marble at Parliament House. This isn't a home for politicians. This is our nation's capital building that we all own as Australians. I want the book thrown at them. I mean, down in Victoria,
That's right.
the Black Lives Matter, 80,000 of them protest. There's not an arrest. We have two publicans who speak out against the Andrews government, Chris Lucas, the restaurateur, and Paul DiMartino. You'll have had him on your show. He's been quite critical of the lockdowns. Both of them copped $10,000 fines last week for being open, police argue, beyond 8 o'clock.
All we get here is language, it's disgraceful. I mean, the public want to know one simple thing, don't they, Peter? Are these people being arrested and locked up on remand until the severity of their offences? So can I just ask you, because I couldn't find out, where are they tonight? Walking around the...
No, I couldn't find it either. No. They should be locked up. They should be on remand. Their organisations should cop serious fines to clean all this up, because it'll be the taxpayer yet again, Alan. It'll be the taxpayer yet again.
And gutless politicians, weak-kneed politicians. Peter, Anastasia Palaszczuk, now these premiers are out of control. There's talk of some sort of investigation into Daniel Andrews. You and I talked about that. The office paying a Labor strategist millions of dollars to assess the political impact of the state's 112-day lockdown. Now reports out of Queensland that Anastasia relied on secretive monthly polling of Queenslanders to help her decide on the scope and duration of the coronavirus restrictions since just after the pandemic began. And reports that her office has received waves of focus group and polling research, one of which cost taxpayers over $500,000. Peter, it's boring to ask you, but who is holding these people accountable?
I haven't seen the opposition out there hard on it. I haven't seen the opposition out there hard enough in Victoria. I mean, in Victoria's case, it's been the Australian newspaper. I mean, this is purely and simply pandemic by focus group, right? The health advice is clearly meaningless if the focus groups have a different view. The Premier's clearly got them front of mind. This is why we need all of the health advice out there publicly, so we can see if there's a contest or a difference between what the health advice might be telling the Premier and what the focus groups might be telling the Premier. And let me tell Australians, this is not allowed federally. This is not allowed federally, and what we're copying at state government levels, where there isn't enough security, where there are weak oppositions, we should not and should never stand for as Australian taxpayers. It's
Good
wrong.
on you, Peter.
It's absolutely
100%.
wrong.
100% correct. Then you've got this piece of information used by Daniel Andrews to justify locking down 1.6 million regional Victorians. Turns out to have been false. A COVID sewage detected in the Premier's hometown of Wangaratta. Even the Premier doesn't know the difference between sewage and sewerage. Sewage is the stuff in the pipes. The sewage are the pipes. But there were no coronavirus cases outside of Melbourne. Andrews talked about a recent detection of virus fragments at a wastewater treatment facility in Wangaratta. He actually said, quote, "We have a sewerage test that's detected COVID-19. I think he meant sewage. But it was one detection, and the Wangaratta wastewater detection was the justification for making the lockdown. Health Minister Martin Foley controlling, wouldn't answer the questions, but it took the mayor of the town to simply say, hang on, there was one positive test 2 weeks ago, subsequent test negative, 1.6 million lockdown. Where, Peter, where is the opposition, for God's sake?
Look, I don't know. I mean, eventually he was shamed into releasing regional Victoria from the lockdown. I don't think metropolitan Melbourne will be released. They're due to be released on Thursday. They did say it would be for 7 days. No one believes this mob down here. Any time frame they set, they're always extended. But this is a real hardship for country people. I mean, there are towns where there has been no COVID for months and months and months.
Yep.
And they were walking around, basically on the farms and in the paddocks with masks on. I mean, it's nuts. They've lost the moral authority when they have this sort of Peter Wolf stuff. And it's interesting too, I've noticed that the Premier of Victoria is picking and choosing now which press conferences he turns up to. He wasn't there today. We have a horrific case out of New South Wales where a mother who is fully vaccinated, who is having constant COVID tests, wants to come down to Melbourne to be with her daughter who has aggressive breast cancer, going through chemo, 2 little kids, 2 little toddler. She wants to be able to support her daughter. She's happy to do 2 weeks of quarantine at her own expense. Not allowed, right? Not allowed. All these premiers are hiding under the desk, and yet all these activists can't launch.
Let me tell you something. If it wasn't for Sky News and for people like you and me and Andrew and others, Chris Kenny and so on, and Paul, none of this would be aired and get any kind of ventilation. So keep at it, Peter. We'll keep at it. Always lovely to talk to you. Head off and have a wonderful night, and we'll see you soon, eh?
Good to be with you, Alan, as always.
Absolutely. There she is. Lovely lady, isn't she? Peter Credlin. We'll be back after the break. Oh, thank you for your text. They're wonderful. A lot of people supporting Tanya Davies in New South Wales. But Margaret from Ballarat, Morrison's completely out of touch. He needs to start getting his act together and leading the country. Jessica from Cairns, when we need Morrison on one side, he pops up on the other. Fix our current crisis. Stop peddling climate change. Tim from Wollongong, Gladys continues to prove she's completely unaware of the damage she's doing to her people. Jonathan from Sydney, how can we be expected to trust the New South Wales government when they continue to push their daily fear conferences and refuse to give workers their livelihoods back? James from Brisbane, what's happening in New South Wales? Their government doesn't even seem to know. Sean from the Central Coast, the health experts seem to be unqualified or just downright confused. We deserve a bit of clarity. Belinda from Newcastle, Australians are fed up. It's time these politicians are held to account and sacked. George from Adelaide, how did Australia get to this point with zero accountability? Concerning to say the least. Ken from Byron Bay, these so-called leaders need to take a pay cut, at least for the duration of their imposed lockdowns. Phil from Melbourne, when will these one-trick pony politicians try something other than pushing their relentless fear tactics? Disturbing, isn't it? And from the program last night, Michael Westerman from Adelaide says, it was lovely hearing from Archbishop Anthony Fisher on the show. His wise words are desperately needed in challenging times like these. Philip Thorley from Hobart said, we certainly are not a godless country. We have a strong religious culture throughout Australia and many of our traditions are faith-based. Make sure you fill in your census form tonight. David Hamilton from the Sunshine Coast, Queensland says, Scott Morrison is needed now more than ever. We need a leader who'll stand up and clearly guide us to recovery, not one who remains silent. Grace Williams from Albany in WA. If the Morrison government acted immediately and transparently, we wouldn't be in this mess. Instead, they pushed flawed plans and mixed messages. Mari Rivers from Newcastle. Our government's incompetence is destroying local business and family stability. If the people don't stand up now, we won't have a country left to defend. Norman Burns from Melbourne. I can't believe this is happening in Australia. How is it fair that businesses are forced to lose their income while politicians get to keep theirs? Isn't that good, eh? That was your saver tonight. Well, look, here we go again. If it's not coronavirus, it's climate change. And of course, it's all about modelling. May I offer the unfashionable observation that much of the policy on coronavirus derives from flawed modelling. Neil Ferguson from the Imperial College in London provided the epidemiological modelling that informed policy making on coronavirus in the UK and other countries and forecast a worst-case scenario of up to 510,000 deaths in the UK if no action was taken. Restrictions were put in place and the deaths are currently at 130,000. It forecast a best case scenario for America of 1.1 million deaths, a worst case scenario of 2.2 million on the same basis. As of today, 633,000, a difference of either 100% or 400% wrong. In Australia, similar modelling, published on April 7 last year, said with tight quarantine, isolation and social distancing, there'd still be 2.9 million infected, 200,000 would require hospitalisation, 5,000 would need to be in intensive care, although that didn't take into account the effect of any lockdowns. As at today, the total cases are not 2.9 million, but 37,000. Hospitalisations not 200,000, but 432. Intensive care numbers not 5,000, 62. Modelling, hopelessly exaggerated, even taking lockdowns into account. People are frightened by this type of modelling. Well, today, more modelling on climate change by this Intergovernmental Panel 6th Assessment Report. Well, let's stick to the facts. And let me go back on a little revision lesson. The godfather of climate change is a bloke by the name of Maurice Strong. He's now dead. A Canadian businessman and an oil and mineral billionaire. He was the president of Power Corporation of Canada. He got the United Nations bug and was credited with forming the United Nations Environment Programme. We live with his legacy today. He said in 1992, and I quote, "We may get to the point where the only way of saving the world will be for industrialised civilisation to collapse. Isn't it our responsibility to bring this about?" Unquote. He was eventually caught in a web of theft and corruption and fled to communist China. When he died in 2015, Quadrant magazine wrote an article about him, the godfather of climate change. In the opening paragraph, Quadrant magazine said, and I quote, "The consummate sleazebag, thief and all-round corruptocrat who launched and shaped the UN effort to rid the world of carbon dioxide has died, appropriately enough, as his heirs gather in Paris to rob the world blind. Good riddance," unquote. Well, this bloke and his mates are the people and the policies at whose altar the bedwetters kneel. Now, I know we're all for experts and listen to the science. Well, Professor Stephen Schneider was the lead author of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, reports of 2001 and 2007. He was the Stanford Professor of Climatology, died in 2010. But he said of global warming, and I quote, "We need to get some broad-based support to capture the public's imagination. So we have to offer up scary scenarios, make simplified, dramatic statements, and make little mention of any doubts. Each of us has to decide what the right balance is between being effective and being honest." A professor of climatology. The first chairman of the IPCC, this mongrel mob, Sir John Houghton, in his 1994 book, Global Warming, The Complete Briefing, said, quote, "If we want a good environmental policy in the future, we'll have to have a disaster." 1994, Paul Watson, the co-founder of Greenpeace, said, "It doesn't matter what's true, it only matters what people believe is true." Christine Stewart, the former Canadian Minister for the Environment, said, quote, "No matter if the science of global warming is all phony, climate change provides the greatest opportunity to bring about equality and justice in the world." So get it? Climate change is about justice and equality. What about the Emeritus Professor of Ecology at the University of Santa Barbara, Daniel Botkin, who said, quote, "The only way to get our society to truly change is to frighten people with the possibility of catastrophe," unquote. Don't forget, the founder of the UN Environmental Programme, Maurice Strong, quote, "We may get to the point where the only way of saving the world will be for industrialised civilisation to collapse. Isn't it our responsibility to bring this about?" Unquote. And these people, determined to stand the capitalist free world on its head, are everywhere. Christiana Figueres of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change said in February 2014, quote, "This is the first time in the history of mankind that we are setting ourselves the task of intentionally, within a defined period of time, to change the economic development model that has been reigning for at least 150 years since the Industrial Revolution," unquote. So here today is another report which seeks to bind governments to all of this crap. The Paris Agreement is a signed agreement by 196 countries to limit temperature increases to 1.5 degrees centigrade. You've heard Bjorn Lomborg on this program many times, the Danish author and the visiting professor at the Copenhagen Business School. Bjorn Lomborg wrote in 2017, and I quote, "The findings from the major climate models are clear. achieving the 1.5 degrees centigrade target would require nothing less than the entire planet abandoning the use of every single fossil fuel in less than 4 years. Unquote. Doesn't that equate to collapsing the industrialised civilisation? Yet we're being belted over the head with this stuff again today. Bjorn Lomborg said in 2017, come January 21, and this was 4 years on from this all high-minded talk of 1.5 degrees, which we've got again today, Lomborg said, think about what that looks like. We'd have no new iron or steel which undergird global construction, no more fossil fuel-based cement, which at about 4 billion tonnes annually is the building block of the modern age, and without an effective scalable alternative to replace the present way of making fertiliser, we'd be looking at half of humanity starving. He further said in 2017, achieving 1.5 degrees centigrade, and I repeat, that's what all this is about today, Lomborg said, quote, requires us to shut down the power sources for more than 4/5 of the planet's economy in less than 40 months. He said it's a testament to the warped climate conversation that is actually necessary to spell this out. And no, he said, this is not going to happen. Lomborg quotes the one-time advisor to Al Gore, one of the world's best-known climate change scientists, not Al Gore, that's this Jim Hansen, who said this. Many well-meaning people proceed under the illusion that, quote, soft renewable energies will replace fossil fuels if the government tries harder and provides more subsidies. But he said, suggesting that renewables will let us phase rapidly off fossil fuels in the United States, India, or the world as a whole is almost the equivalent of believing in the Easter Bunny and the Tooth Fairy, unquote. Jim Hansen, climate science advisor to Al Gore. Listen to this, Lomborg, quote, using the best peer-reviewed energy economic models, we can calculate the cost for major economies and find a global price tag from all of this. In total, the loss, this is for 1.5, reducing to 1.5 degrees, cutting back the temperatures, the loss in gross domestic product from the Paris Accord adds up to US $1 trillion to US $2 trillion every year by 2030 and for every year for the rest of the century. He said, this makes Paris the most expensive treaty in history. Well, today our Prime Minister quoted John Kerry, who said that if China and America go to zero tomorrow, which of course is rubbish, China has no intention of going anywhere near zero, but this Kerry apparently says it won't change a thing. Well, I want to give the Prime Minister 100 out of 10. He has said today he'll not commit to a target of net zero emissions. He'll use technology to address the issue. He refused to commit to a legislated net zero emissions target. He said, and I quote, I won't be signing a blank cheque on behalf of Australians to targets without plans, unquote. This is the finest statement of leadership the Prime Minister has made in months. And now the left-wing media will climb into him. He'll be everywhere tomorrow. Prime Minister, I said this last night, keep saying it and add one thing. If you want net zero emissions, Prime Minister, say, vote for the other side. But then say, I'm not going to destroy the economy, jack up energy prices and put people out of work for an energy policy that does not make sense. Make it a single issue election cause. And I'm telling you something, the electorate will save you. China is not buying this zero emission stuff. May I say to those in Canberra and in the wider media who seemingly can't read, Bloomberg News, credible, as you know, on August 5 days ago, published a story that China's top planning authority has authorised more coal mines to restart production. The first step, it said, is 15 across the northern provinces, which will deliver 44 million tonnes of coal. The Bloomberg report also indicated that authorities in early August, about 10 days ago, announced the restart of 38 coal mines in Inner Mongolia. Then the report says this. All of this follows last month's recommendation from China's top policymakers for an easing of aggressive steps to curb emissions as the nation seeks to meet power demand and maintain growth. Unquote. There it is in black and white. China are not coming to the party. Well done, Prime Minister. Believe in John Kerry, who flies around in a private jet? No, thank you. Next thing, we'll believe in the Tooth Fairy. But look back to Lomborg, who said, the loss in gross domestic product from the Paris Agreement adds up to US $1 trillion to $2 trillion every year by 2030 and for every year for the rest of the century. And that Paris, he said, is the most expensive treaty in history. Bjorn Lomborg said, quote, the UN's largest global poll of nearly 10 million people's priorities reveals climate change comes last for most of the world's population, behind education, health, food, and 12 other more pressing issues. He further argues that analysis by the Copenhagen Consensus, where Lomborg is a visiting professor, has highlighted, his words, many phenomenal development investments where a fraction of the Paris Treaty's budget would help vulnerable communities much more today than carbon cuts would in 100 years. Lomborg said, if every nation, including the US, extended its Paris Agreement promises past 2030 and kept them going throughout the century, temperatures would drop by less than 0.2 of a degree. And Lomborg believes in climate change, but is totally opposed to the way it's being addressed. Lomborg says climate is not the only challenge facing the world of poorer countries. He said, as the UN survey says, it's probably their least important challenge. Well, I repeat, this is a golden opportunity for Scott Morrison to separate himself from the climate change alarmists on the other side. Let me repeat. I'll tell you something again. If the Prime Minister is prepared to stand up and say, we are not going down this zero path until China does, which will be never, we're not going to be part of what the godfather of climate change sought, the collapse of industrial civilization. And the Prime Minister should say, let the other side embrace that stuff. My side won't. Make the next election a single issue election. And Prime Minister Morrison, you'll walk in. Oh, thank you for your text. I've got to say they're inspirational. Some great people out there. That's the positive for the night, for every night. Ben from Sydney. Tanya Davies' words are a breath of fresh air. Good on her standing up for our rights and freedom. Emma from Darwin. Emma, thank you for texting us. Tanya Davies is a woman with courage and integrity. I have the utmost respect for everything she's doing for Australia. Greg from the Gold Coast says, the arrogance of our leaders is disgusting. Their true colours are showing through all of this, and they're not bright. Hayden from Tamworth, these lockdowns are relentless. People are starting to lose all signs of hope. We can't continue like this. David from Perth, seeing the Parliament House defaced was disgusting. These people should be given consequences. And who is securing our national buildings? Laura from Canberra, we're going nowhere fast. The government needs to wake up and change its failed tactics. Jaden from Coffs Harbour, the climate change narrative has been consistently used for personal gain. Sadly, many people are completely convinced that's true. Kyle from Geelong, climate change is just another way elites have used fear against their people. Well, we'll keep at it, I have to tell you. Now, look, my correspondence about this lockdown and the damage it's doing to people is immensely distressing. Apart from Tanya Davies in New South Wales and Matt Canavan last night, no one seems to care. As we said when I was talking to Matt last night, Senator Canavan, at these press conferences, no one says how many small businesses have gone under, how many marriages have been broken, how many people have completely lost their jobs, how the young people are responding. One senior executive in education told me last night he couldn't say anything publicly and he couldn't even talk to me. He was too distressed. 2 of his young people had committed suicide. As Matt Canavan said, the Delta variant is killing fewer people than did the outbreaks of last year. Not because Delta is less fatal, but because many of our most vulnerable are vaccinated. Although I also note that Delta is more transmissible. Yet here we have a virtual scorched earth policy in Victoria, New South Wales and Queensland, where everything by government edict is virtually destroyed. Steve Christou is the Mayor of Cumberland City Council in the western suburbs of Sydney. Over 200,000 people taking in Auburn, Fairfield, Granville and Prospect, that's 4 state electorates, and 4 federal electorates, Blaxland, Greenway, McMahon, Parramatta. It's 28 square miles. I counted today 29 suburbs. The median age of the people who live here, 32. Children 0 to 14 make up almost a quarter of the population. And the cultural diversity, Lebanese, Chinese, Australian, English, Indian. 6 different languages, 5 other than English. The median weekly personal income, $500. For a family, $1,400. How does a Premier on $8,000 a week have any understanding of what these poor people are being asked to endure? Steve Christou joins me, the Mayor of Cumberland City Council. Steve, thank you for your time. To your local government area, it's shut down, along with Fairfield, Canterbury, Bankstown, Liverpool, Blacktown, Parramatta, Georges River and Campbelltown. What does shut down mean to your people?
Thanks for having us on, Alan. Shutdown is essentially Armageddon for the residents I represent. You know, we're one of the lowest socio-demographics in New South Wales. These are people that have migrated from overseas, don't have high-paying jobs, good working class people, a vibrant community, and essentially their lives have been decimated by not only this insensitive government, and I called them moronic imbeciles the other week, and that's exactly what they are, but that goes for the New South Wales opposition as well, because they've got no idea how they've absolutely destroyed people's lives. People can't afford...
No, I mean, you told me today, Steve, these people have barely more than 2 weeks saving in their banks. I mean, how can people pay the mortgage, pay the rent, pay the bills? You say they're skipping meals to get by.
Yeah, every day this is a common occurrence. They had 2 weeks savings 6 weeks ago. Now, our people, they're construction workers, retail workers, hospitality workers. As we all know, these industries aren't currently operating. They've exhausted their savings.
See, just to interrupt there for our viewers know, there's a 5 kilometre limit. So many of these people would have worked 7 or 8 kilometres away from their home, but they can't go beyond 5 kilometres. So you've got in the construction industry, I think, over 10,000 people in lockdown, no job.
10,000 people, no job. I'm inundated with calls every day from concerned tradies, but also their spouses. Their wives are ringing up saying, they've destroyed our lives. They're not only stopping up my husband from working now, but they're stuffing up his long-term employment opportunities. Because when a builder calls you up and says, mate, I need you to do a job, and you go, oh, I'm sorry, I can't do it. I'm in lockdown. Sorry, mate, we're going to have to go elsewhere. But what happens is they pick up a new subcontractor, and then that new subcontractor gets fed the future jobs as well. And that's the problem.
And these people can't get a vaccine either. I mean, they try to book vaccinations, large wait times. Gladys Berejiklian says she understands. Do you think your people think anyone in government understands?
No, my residents are very upset, but not only at the state government, they're very upset at their local state members as well, because we have 2 Labor state members out here that have virtually been hiding in their lounge rooms, refuse to come out on full salaries, and our people don't get this. They won't come out and defend their community. No. How can these state members understand when they're hiding in their lounge rooms, posting on social media on over $3,000 a week, and we've got residents out here at Cumberland City Council that are trying to live off $700 and $750 a week if they've been able to access a government benefit?
Unbelievable. Steve, it's unbelievable. Then there are the kids, of course. Look, it's depressing to think about it. You and I will keep in touch and we'll talk often so at least the public beyond your local government area understand the problems. They're mammoth. Thank you for talking with us. Thank you for all you do. And my best wishes to everyone out there. My best wishes count for nothing, of course. How you're surviving, I don't know. But we're with you in spirit. Thanks, Steve. There he is, the Mayor of Cumberland Council. I don't know how anyone in government could even listen to that and continue the way they are. Back after the break. Well, as is the case every night, the texts are on fire. Wendy from Melbourne, the costs attached to these climate initiatives are astronomical. We can't afford the bill. Justin from Armidale, I couldn't agree more. Why should we make drastic energy changes when China won't do it as well? It doesn't make sense. And John from the Central Coast, Sydney families are suffering more than these politicians can ever imagine. They have no idea what they're doing. Dennis from Newcastle, exactly right. People are forced to skip meals just to stay afloat. Where is the compassion? And Tom from Sydney, I never thought I'd see the tragedy that is happening to families in Sydney. This shouldn't happen in a free country. It's true, isn't it? Look, before we go, the Liberal Party, I've got to say to you, sadly, is crumbling. A leader's number one job is to keep the troops together. On that evidence, Scott Morrison is failing at that task. The big government agenda he promotes is the antithesis of what true Liberals stand for. He throws money at every issue, seemingly not a fiscally conservative bone in his body. He goes into hiding on most issues or blames someone else and then chucks on the baseball cap and pretends all is well. Australians right now want more of their leader, someone who'll get into the ring and lead the fight. Now, the polls yesterday, as you saw, have Labor well in front. The political elites in the Liberal Party have turned their backs on their supporter base, both in voterland and media circles. And then, come election time, they'll beg for our support. Well, the begging will fall on deaf ears. Sometimes you have to burn the house down before you rebuild. Remember how the Prime Minister doesn't hold a hose? Well, the next election, he'll have to start because there'll be bushfires everywhere. In the federal seat of North Sydney, Trent Zimmerman is finally going to face the fury of voters in his electorate. You've probably never heard of him. Trent Zimmerman. He wouldn't make a dent in a pincushion. When Joe Hockey resigned from the seat, Zimmerman won the 2015 North Sydney by-election. Well, won is a loose word. It was claimed up to 550 Liberal branch members were unable to vote after the Liberal state executive pushed through a shortened pre-selection process to select Zimmerman, who just happened to be the head of the body that set the rules for Liberal pre-selections. In something of an understatement, that's been claimed as a conflict of interest. It doesn't pass the sniff test. He's now facing a grassroots campaign to oust him, made up of a few groups called Voices of North Sydney and Time's Up Trent. They're on the hunt for an independent candidate and apparently will announce one at the end of the month. This electorate has form. After all, they were represented by the very good independent Ted Mack for many years. The impotent Zimmerman will finally be challenged, and Mr Morrison's current failure to lead with Liberal values won't do him or the Liberal brand any favours. Rest assured, Labor's not the only political party facing an identity crisis and an electoral challenge. Which brings me to the thought for the night. Being challenged in life is inevitable. Being defeated is optional. That's it from me. Remember, you can follow my Facebook page, Alan Jones Australia. For all the content, Paul's up next. See you tomorrow night. Good night.